The dust of the Montana Territory hung in the air like a veil as Madeline Grayson's silhouette appeared on the horizon, her once steady gait now a labored limp that marked each painful step toward Wildwood Creek. It was 1873, and the small frontier town hadn't changed in the year she'd been gone, though she certainly had, in ways that ran deeper than the visible scars she carried home. "Well, I'll be damned," muttered Silas Jenkins from his perch outside the general store, tobacco juice dribbling into his graying beard. "Look who's dragging herself back to town." Madeline's copper hair, once flowing and vibrant, was cropped short and dulled by trail dust. Her calico dress hung loose on her frame, telling the silent story of hardship without a single word. The confident stride that had carried her away from Wildwood Creek was now reduced to an uneven rhythm, right foot dragging slightly against the rutted dirt road. A small crowd began to gather as she approached. Some faces showed genuine surprise, others thinly veiled amusement at her diminished state. Laughter rippled through the onlookers, not the welcoming kind, but the cruel chuckle of those who'd predicted her failure when she'd left. "Looks like life beyond Wildwood Creek wasn't the adventure you thought it'd be," called out Martha Winters, whose daughter had married the banker's son during Madeline's absence. More laughter followed, sharper now, slicing through the afternoon heat. Madeline kept her gaze forward, jaw set firm against their mockery. She'd faced worse than small-town ridicule in the past year. Much worse. Then a figure stepped from the shadowed porch of the Wildwood Saloon. The laughter died as Keegan Andrews moved with purpose toward Madeline, his tall frame blocking the sun as he approached. The locals fell silent, watching. Keegan had never been a man of many words, but when he spoke, people listened. He stopped 3 paces from Madeline, his eyes taking in her weathered appearance, the hard-won strength in her posture despite the limp. A smile not of mockery but of profound respect touched his lips. "They laughed when she came back limping," Keegan said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet street. He turned to face the gathered townspeople, challenge in his gaze. "She walked through hell and she's home now." The crowd shifted uncomfortably under his stare. Keegan Andrews was the most respected rancher in the territory, a man whose judgment carried weight. If he welcomed Madeline, others would think twice about their scorn. He offered his arm to Madeline. "Miss Grayson, may I escort you to wherever you're headed?" Their eyes met hers, wary but grateful, his steady and certain. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition of shared understanding that would grow into something neither had been looking for. "Thank you, Mr. Andrews," she replied, her voice stronger than her body appeared. "I'd be obliged." As they walked together down Wildwood Creek's main street, Madeline's limp was still visible, but somehow it seemed less pronounced with Keegan beside her. The townspeople watched them go, whispers replacing laughter. What none of them knew not yet was that Madeline Grayson hadn't just survived her time away. She'd returned with secrets that would change Wildwood Creek forever. And Keegan Andrews, with his own mysterious past, would be the one person who might understand exactly what she'd endured and why she'd come back. It was Hattie Miller who provided Madeline temporary lodging above the millinery shop. The widow had always held a soft spot for the spirited young woman, even when others in town had clicked their tongues at her independence. "You'll stay as long as you need," Hattie said firmly as she showed Madeline to the small but clean room. "Don't mind those vultures out there. They've got nothing better to do than pick at others." "Thank you, Mrs. Miller." Madeline set her worn leather satchel, the only possession she'd returned, with on the patchwork quilt covering the narrow bed. "I won't impose for long." Hattie noticed how Madeline favored her right leg, how she winced slightly when she thought no one was watching. "What happened out there, child?" she asked gently. Madeline's green eyes clouded. "I'd rather not speak of it just yet." The older woman nodded, respecting her privacy. "That Andrews boy walked you here. Never seen him take such an interest before." A faint blush colored Madeline's cheeks. "He was simply being kind when others weren't." Was all Hattie said, but her knowing smile spoke volumes. "Rest now. We'll talk more tomorrow." After Hattie left, Madeline sank onto the bed, the weight of her journey finally catching up with her. She hadn't expected a hero's welcome in Wildwood Creek, not after leaving the way she had, but the open mockery had cut deeper than she'd anticipated. All except Keegan Andrews. She'd known of him before she left, of course. Everyone in the territory knew of the Andrews Ranch and its taciturn owner, but they'd never exchanged more than polite nods in passing. Today was the first time he'd ever really spoken to her. "She walked through hell," he'd said. How could he possibly know? Madeline pulled her satchel closer, fingers brushing over the hidden pocket where she kept the document that had cost her so much to obtain. If anyone discovered what she carried, what she knew, she'd never find peace, not even here. Sleep came in fitful bursts that night, haunted by memories of gunshots and flames. Dawn broke with the insistent crowing of roosters and the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer. Madeline dressed carefully, choosing her one remaining good dress, a sensible blue cotton that had seen better days but still maintained its dignity. She braided her short hair as best she could, determined to face the town with whatever grace she could muster. The stairs creaked under her weight as she descended to the shop below. Hattie was already arranging a display of ribbon-trimmed bonnets, and she smiled warmly at Madeline's appearance. "There's coffee and cornbread in the back room," she offered. "And the Gazette is looking for someone to help with typesetting if you're interested in work." Madeline nodded gratefully. "I'll inquire today." The bell above the shop door jingled, and both women turned to see Keegan Andrews removing his hat as he stepped inside. The morning light caught the auburn highlights in his dark hair, and Madeline noticed perhaps for the first time the intensity of his hazel eyes. "Miss Grayson," he said with a respectful nod. "Mrs. Miller." Hattie's eyes twinkled with interest. My, Mr. Andrews. I don't believe I've ever seen you in a millinery shop before." His smile was brief but genuine. "There's a first time for everything, madam." He turned his attention to Madeline. "I've come to offer you transportation, Miss Grayson. I understand you'll be seeking employment, and Wildwood Creek is no easy place to navigate on foot, especially." He paused, his gaze briefly dropping to her injured leg before meeting her eyes again with no trace of pity. Madeline felt a surge of pride. "I can manage, Mr. Andrews." "I'm certain you can," he replied without hesitation. "But my buggy is already hitched, and I have business in town today. It would be no inconvenience." Hattie busied herself with the bonnets, poorly concealing her delight at the exchange. Madeline considered his offer. Pride warred with practicality. The Gazette office was at the far end of town, and her leg was throbbing already from the descent down the stairs. "Very well," she conceded. "Thank you." Outside, Keegan's buggy waited, a handsome conveyance drawn by a matching pair of bay horses. He helped her up with steady hands that betrayed surprising gentleness for a man who worked with cattle and rough cowhands. As they set off down the main street, Madeline was acutely aware of the stares from pedestrians and shopkeepers. Riding beside Keegan Andrews was sure to fuel gossip, but she found herself caring less than expected. "May I ask where you've been this past year?" Keegan inquired after several minutes of comfortable silence. Madeline tensed. "I traveled, saw different places." He nodded, not pressing further. "And now you're back." "Yes." She looked straight ahead. "Though many seem to think I shouldn't be." Keegan's hands tightened on the reins. People fear what they don't understand, and they don't understand you, Miss Grayson. Do you? The question slipped out before she could stop it. He considered this, his profile strong against the morning sky. No, he admitted finally, but I'd like to. Something in his tone made her turn to study him. There was no trace of the entitlement she'd seen in other men's eyes when they looked at her, just genuine interest, and perhaps a recognition of something kindred. Most people don't look beyond what they can immediately see, Madeline said carefully. I'm not most people. Keegan slowed the horses as they approached the Gazette office. Neither are you. He assisted her down from the buggy, his support discreet but steady as her feet touched the ground. For a moment they stood closer than propriety might allow, and Madeline caught the scent of leather and pine that clung to him. Thank you for the ride, Mr. Andrews. Keegan, he corrected gently. Madeline, then, she offered in return, surprising herself. He nodded, a smile warming his features. I'll wait and drive you back when you're finished. That's not necessary, I know. His eyes held hers, but I'll wait all the same. As Madeline entered the Gazette office, she couldn't help but wonder if Keegan Andrews had his own secrets, and if, perhaps, they might someday share the burdens they each carried alone. The newspaper office was cramped but orderly, with the familiar scent of ink and paper that Madeline had always found comforting. Albert Porter, the editor and owner, looked up from his desk with surprise that quickly gave way to careful neutrality. Miss Grayson, he acknowledged. This is unexpected. Mr. Porter. She stood as straight as her injury allowed. I understand you're in need of someone for typesetting. He studied her for a moment, then gestured to a chair. You have experience. I worked for the Sacramento Daily Union before returning east. It wasn't a complete lie, though her role there had been far more complicated than mere typesetting. Porter's eyebrows rose with interest. Sacramento, that's quite a distance. As I said, I traveled. The editor leaned back, considering her. Town's full of talk about your return. I'm aware. And your condition. Madeline's chin lifted slightly. My condition is temporary. My skills are not. Porter's lips twitched in what might have been respect. Fair enough. He pushed a stack of handwritten pages toward her. Can you set these for tomorrow's edition? I'll pay 50 cents a day, 6 days a week. It was less than she'd earned out west, but more than most women could hope for in Wildwood Creek. I'll start immediately, Porter nodded. Back rooms through there. Press is already inked. For the next several hours, Madeline lost herself in the familiar work, her fingers remembering the rhythm of arranging the metal type, despite the months that had passed since she'd last done so. The physical labor helped distract from both the pain in her leg and the memories that threatened to surface whenever her mind had too much idle time. By mid-afternoon, she had completed the typesetting for the entire front page and half of the second. Porter appeared in the doorway, surprise evident as he inspected her work. Impressive, he admitted. You're faster than my last setter and more accurate too. Thank you. Madeline straightened, wincing slightly as she put weight on her bad leg. Porter noticed but said nothing directly. That's enough for today. Come back tomorrow at 8. When she emerged from the Gazette office, the sun was lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the dusty street. True to his word, Keegan was waiting, though he'd moved the buggy into the shade and was reading a book while he waited. He looked up at her approach. Closing the volume, she caught a glimpse of what appeared to be poetry and stepped down to assist her. Successful? He asked. I start tomorrow at 8. Madeline couldn't keep a note of satisfaction from her voice. Congratulations. His smile seemed genuinely pleased for her. Have you eaten? The hotel serves a decent stew. The unexpected invitation caught her off guard. Dining publicly with a man would certainly set tongues wagging even more than they already were. Seeing her hesitation, Keegan added, "Mrs. Miller is welcome to join us, of course." The consideration in this gesture, offering propriety while still extending the invitation, touched her. "Thank you, but I should return to help Hattie with the evening meal. She's being kind enough to house me. I shouldn't take advantage." Keegan nodded, not pressing the matter as he helped her into the buggy. Once seated beside her, he asked, "May I call on you properly sometime, Madeline?" The directness of the question, delivered with such quiet confidence, brought a warmth to her cheeks. "I'm not sure that would be wise, Keegan. I'm not. I'm not the same person who left this town. None of us stay the same." His voice held a depth of understanding that made her wonder what changes he had undergone in his own life. "But if you'd rather I didn't, I'll respect your wishes." Madeline looked at his profile as he guided the horses through town. There was something solid about Keegan Andrews, a steadiness that had been absent in every other man she'd known. Despite her better judgment, she found herself saying, "Sunday, after church. You could call then if you'd like." The smile that curved his lips made something flutter in her chest. "Sunday it is." As they traveled back toward Hattie's shop, the golden late afternoon light bathed Wildwood Creek in a glow that almost made it beautiful. For the first time since returning, Madeline allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope that perhaps she could build something here, after all, something far different from what she'd left behind, but something worthwhile nonetheless. What she couldn't know was that forces were already in motion that would test this fragile new beginning, and that the hell she thought she'd escaped was about to reach all the way to Wildwood Creek. That evening, as Madeline helped Hattie prepare a simple supper of beans and cornbread, the older woman's curiosity finally got the better of her discretion. "2 encounters with Keegan Andrews in as many days," she remarked, stirring the pot with more vigor than necessary. "That man's hardly spoken 10 words to anyone in town for months, and suddenly he's offering buggy rides and waiting hours outside the Gazette." Madeline concentrated on slicing the cornbread. "He was being neighborly." "Neighborly," Hattie snorted. "That man owns the largest cattle spread in 3 counties. He doesn't do neighborly without reason." Unsure how to respond, Madeline changed the subject. "Mr. Porter hired me today. I start tomorrow." Hattie's expression softened. "That's wonderful, dear." "Albert Porter's a fair man, if a bit gruff." She set the table with practiced efficiency. "Now about your leg, it's healing," Madeline interrupted quickly. "Just needs time. Dr. Jenkins could no doctors." The words came out sharper than intended, and Madeline immediately regretted her tone. "I'm sorry, Hattie. I've seen enough doctors to last a lifetime." Concern creased the older woman's face. "What happened to you out there, Madeline? When you left, you were so full of fire, so determined to find your brother." Madeline's hand trembled, nearly dropping the knife. "Please," she whispered. "I can't talk about Michael. Not yet." Understanding dawned in Hattie's eyes, followed by profound sadness. "Oh, child, I'm so sorry." They ate in silence after that, the weight of unspoken grief hanging between them. Later, alone in her room, Madeline carefully unwrapped the bandage around her right thigh. The bullet wound had healed poorly, an ugly, puckered scar surrounded by skin still inflamed and tender. The salve she applied provided temporary relief, but she knew the damage was permanent, just like the memories. She retrieved her satchel, fingers finding the hidden pocket where the document lay folded and sealed. The evidence that had cost Michael his life and nearly her own. Evidence against men powerful enough to reach across territories. Men who wouldn't rest until they recovered what she'd taken. Men who might already know she had returned to Wildwood Creek. Sleep eluded her again that night. her mind replaying the frantic escape from Sacramento, the weeks of hiding, the desperate journey east. By morning, dark circles shadowed her eyes, but she dressed with determination. Work would be her sanctuary as it had always been. The following days established a rhythm. Madeline rose early, worked diligently at the Gazette, and returned to Hattie's each evening. The townsfolk's open mockery gradually gave way to curious observation, then to reluctant acceptance as her quiet competence became evident. Porter even entrusted her with editing some of the less important articles, recognizing her facility with language. She saw Keegan only once during that week, a brief encounter outside the general store where they exchanged polite greetings before he was called away on business. But the anticipation of Sunday's visit lingered in her thoughts, an unexpected brightness in days otherwise consumed by vigilant caution. Sunday dawned clear and warm for early autumn. Madeline chose her best dress, a modest green cotton that complemented her eyes, and accompanied Hattie to the white clapboard church at the edge of town. She felt the stares as she entered, heard the whispers behind raised hymnals, but kept her head high as she followed Hattie to a pew near the back. Midway through Reverend Thompson's sermon on redemption, the church door opened quietly. Heads turned as Keegan Andrews slipped in, nodding apologetically to the Reverend before taking a seat in the last pew. Madeline kept her gaze forward, but she was acutely aware of his presence, of the murmurs his unexpected appearance generated. Keegan Andrews was not known as a church-going man. After the service, as congregants gathered outside to socialize, Madeline found herself surrounded by several women whose curiosity had finally overcome their initial disdain. "Sacramento must have been quite exciting," remarked Clara Wilson, the banker's wife. Though clearly not without its dangers. Her gaze flicked meaningfully to Madeline's leg. "Every place has its hazards, Mrs. Wilson," Madeline replied evenly, "some less visible than others." "And your poor brother?" inquired another woman, feigning sympathy. "Did you find him?" A sharp pain lanced through Madeline's heart. "Excuse me, ladies, Mrs. Miller is waiting." She turned away, only to find her path blocked by Sheriff Thomas Reed. The lawman's expression was unreadable behind his thick mustache. "Miss Grayson," he said, tipping his hat, "might I have a word?" Madeline's pulse quickened. "Of course, Sheriff." He led her a few steps away from the crowd. "Received a telegraph from Sacramento yesterday. Seems they're mighty interested in your whereabouts." Her mouth went dry. "Is that so?" Reed studied her face. "Anything you'd like to tell me?" "Anything I should know about why the California authorities are asking after you." Before she could formulate a response, a deep voice interjected. "Good morning, Sheriff." "Miss Grayson." Keegan stood beside them, his presence somehow creating a buffer between Madeline and the lawman. Reed's expression soured slightly. "Andrews, unusual to see you at services. Felt the need for spiritual guidance," Keegan replied with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Grayson has agreed to accompany me for Sunday dinner, if you're finished with your questions." The sheriff glanced between them, clearly weighing his options. "We'll continue this conversation another time, Miss Grayson." As Reed walked away, Madeline released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you," she murmured. Keegan offered his arm. "Shall we, Mrs. Miller has already given her blessing." Indeed, Hattie was watching from nearby, her expression a mixture of concern and approval. They walked to the hotel dining room, where Keegan had arranged a private table near the window. The gesture was both considerate and strategic, public enough to maintain propriety, yet removed enough for conversation. After they were seated and had ordered, Keegan leaned forward slightly. "The sheriff's interest seems more than casual." Madeline smoothed her napkin in her lap. He was merely welcoming me back to town. Madeline. His voice was gentle but firm. I won't pry into what you're not ready to share, but I recognize trouble when I see it, and whatever followed you home from California has the law's attention. She stared at him, weighing how much to reveal. Why did you help me? That first day, and now today you don't know me. Something flickered in his eyes, a shadow of recognition, perhaps, or shared pain. Sometimes you don't need to know someone's whole story to recognize when they're fighting a battle alone that no one should have to face. His words struck something deep within her, a chord of understanding that resonated with her own experiences. My brother is dead, she said finally, the admission like glass in her throat. He went to California seeking fortune but found corruption instead. When I received his letter begging for help, I went without hesitation. Keegan remained silent, allowing her to continue at her own pace. By the time I arrived in Sacramento, Michael had uncovered evidence implicating several powerful men in a scheme to defraud the government of land grants. He was killed for what he discovered. Her voice faltered. I was too late to save him, but not too late to recover what he'd found. Understanding dawned in Keegan's expression. And now they want it back. The evidence in my possession could send men to prison, men with connections, money, and a long reach. Madeline met his gaze directly. I came back to Wildwood Creek because it was the last place they would look. A woman alone, returning defeated to her hometown. Who would suspect? The sheriff does, apparently. Reed has always been easily influenced by money or power. She glanced out the window, watching townspeople pass by. It was only a matter of time. Their food arrived, providing a momentary reprieve from the heavy conversation. After the server departed, Keegan spoke again. What will you do? Madeline pushed food around her plate. Deliver the evidence to someone who can act on it without being corrupted. I've arranged contact with a federal marshal, but he won't arrive for another 2 weeks. And until then, I keep my head down and pray those hunting me don't find me first. Keegan's jaw tightened. You shouldn't be alone. Hattie's shop isn't secure, and if Reed is already asking questions. I have no alternative. My family's old cabin outside town was sold years ago. He was quiet for a moment, considering. I have a proposition, he said finally. My foreman's wife is expecting their first child. They've been living in a small house on my property, but it's too cramped now. I've built them a larger place closer to the main house, which means the old cabin is vacant. Madeline stared at him. You're offering me a place to stay, on your ranch. It would be safer than town. No one would think to look for you there, and my men are loyal. They wouldn't betray your presence to strangers asking questions. The offer was tempting, painfully so, but Madeline hesitated. Why would you risk involving yourself? These are dangerous men, Keegan. He met her gaze steadily. Perhaps I have my own reasons for standing against corrupt men who abuse power. There was something in his voice, a personal note that hinted at his own painful history, that made Madeline wonder what battles Keegan Andrews had fought before settling in Montana territory. I'll consider it, she said finally. His smile was warm, transforming his serious features. That's all I ask. As they finished their meal, their conversation turned to lighter topics, books they'd read, places they'd seen, the changing seasons in Montana. Madeline found herself laughing for the first time in months, the weight on her shoulders temporarily lightened by Keegan's thoughtful observations and subtle humor. When he walked her back to Hattie's shop afterward, his hand gently supporting her elbow, Madeline realized with startling clarity that Keegan Andrews had somehow breached the walls she'd built around herself. The realization was both frightening and exhilarating. Thank you for today, she said when they reached Hattie's door. My pleasure entirely. His eyes searched hers. Consider my offer, Madeline, please. She nodded, unable to find words for the emotions tangling inside her. As she watched him walk away, Madeline knew that regardless of her decision about the cabin, something had shifted between them, something that might prove as dangerous as the men pursuing her, but in an entirely different way. Madeline's decision was forced the very next morning. She arrived at the Gazette office to find Porter uncharacteristically agitated. "Two men were here asking about you," he said without preamble. "Well-dressed, not local. Said they were old friends from Sacramento." Her blood ran cold. "What did you tell them?" "That you worked here but weren't in yet." Porter's shrewd eyes studied her. "They didn't strike me as friends, Madeline, more like wolves tracking prey." She swallowed hard. "Thank you for the warning. Are you in some kind of trouble? Because I run a newspaper, not a hideout for fugitives." "I'm not a fugitive," she replied, the half-truth bitter on her tongue. "But yes, there are men who wish me harm." Porter rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "I served with Sheriff Reed during the war. He's not a bad sort, just easily swayed. If you explained your situation, I can't risk it." Madeline's mind was racing. "Mr. Porter, I need to ask for a few days' absence." He frowned but nodded. "Do what you need to do. The job will wait a reasonable time." "Thank you." She turned to leave, then hesitated. "If those men return—" "I never saw you today," Porter assured her. "Far as I know, you might have already left town." Gratitude swelled in her chest. "I won't forget this kindness." She slipped out the back door of the Gazette, keeping to alleys and side streets as she made her way to Hattie's. The older woman was arranging a display when Madeline entered, breathless and pale. "What's happened?" Hattie asked, alarmed. "They're here." Madeline began gathering her meager belongings. "I need to leave immediately." Understanding immediately, Hattie helped her pack. "Where will you go?" Madeline hesitated only briefly before answering. "Keegan Andrews offered me shelter on his ranch. It may be my only option now." Hattie's expression showed both relief and concern. "He's a good man, Madeline. One of the few truly honorable men I've known. But people will talk if you go there alone. My reputation is the least of my concerns right now." Madeline secured her satchel, ensuring the hidden document was still safely concealed. "Wait here," Hattie said, disappearing into her private quarters. She returned moments later with a small revolver. "Take this. It was my husband's." "Hattie, I couldn't." "You can and you will." The older woman pressed the weapon into Madeline's hands. "A woman alone needs protection. I pray you won't need it, but better to have it than wish for it." Emotion tightened Madeline's throat as she accepted the gift. "How will I get to the Andrews Ranch without being seen?" Hattie smiled grimly. "Leave that to me." An hour later, Madeline found herself huddled in the back of Hiram Johnson's vegetable wagon, covered by a tarp and surrounded by sacks of potatoes bound for the Andrews Ranch. Hattie had arranged everything, calling in a favor from the kindly farmer who made weekly deliveries to the larger properties outside town. The journey was uncomfortable, every bump in the road jarring her injured leg, but Madeline endured in silence. When the wagon finally stopped, she heard Hiram's voice talking with someone, presumably a ranch hand, about the delivery. Footsteps approached the wagon, and suddenly the tarp was pulled back to reveal Keegan's concerned face. "Madeline," he breathed, relief evident in his expression. "Hattie sent word you might arrive this way." He helped her from the wagon, steadying her as her stiff leg nearly buckled. "Are you all right?" "They're in town," she replied, voice low despite the privacy of their location behind the ranch's supply shed. "Two men from Sacramento. They were asking about me at the Gazette." Keegan's expression hardened. "You made the right choice coming here." He turned to thank Hiram, pressing extra payment into the farmer's hand with a meaningful look that conveyed the need for discretion. As Hiram's wagon rattled away, Keegan guided Madeline toward a stand of pine trees where a horse was tethered. "The cabin is about a mile from the main house," he explained. "Easier to reach on horseback given your leg." He helped her mount, then swung up behind her. The proximity was intimate, his chest warm against her back, his arms around her as he took the reins, but there was nothing improper in his manner, only protective concern. They rode in silence through a wooded area that eventually opened to a small clearing. The cabin was modest but well built, with a stone chimney and a covered porch. Smoke curled from the chimney, indicating someone had prepared for her arrival. "My housekeeper stocked provisions and started a fire," Keegan explained as he helped her dismount. "She's the only one besides me who knows you're here, and she can be trusted absolutely." Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable, a main room with a stone fireplace, small kitchen area, table and chairs, and a bed tucked in one corner behind a partial wall. Everything was spotlessly clean, with fresh linens and curtains brightening the rustic space. "It's perfect," Madeline said, genuine gratitude in her voice. "I don't know how to thank you." "No thanks necessary." Keegan moved to stoke the fire. "There's food in the pantry, water from the pump outside. No one comes to this part of the property except me, so you should be safe here." Madeline set her satchel on the table, suddenly uncertain now that they were alone in this isolated place. As if sensing her discomfort, Keegan maintained a respectful distance. "I'll leave you to settle in," he said. "There's a rifle above the door and ammunition in the drawer beside the bed, should you need it." She nodded, oddly touched by his practical concern for her safety. "I'll return tomorrow with more supplies," he continued. "Is there anything specific you need?" Madeline thought for a moment. "Paper and ink if possible, and perhaps something to read." His smile was warm. "I think I can manage that." At the door he paused. "Madeline, I want you to know that whatever trouble you're in, whatever you're carrying, you're not alone anymore." The simple declaration, delivered with such quiet certainty, threatened to unravel her carefully maintained composure. For a year, she had carried her burden alone, her grief for Michael, her fear of those pursuing her, her determination to see justice done. The prospect of sharing that weight, even partially, was overwhelming. "Thank you, Keegan," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. After he left, Madeline moved to the window, watching as he rode back toward the main house. Only when his figure disappeared among the trees did she allow herself to release the tears she'd held back for so long. For the first time since Michael's murder, Madeline felt the faintest glimmer of something she'd thought lost forever: hope. The following days established a new rhythm to Madeline's life. She spent her mornings exploring the immediate surroundings of the cabin, gradually strengthening her injured leg through careful exercise. Afternoons were devoted to writing detailed accounts of everything she and Michael had uncovered: names, dates, connections that might help the federal marshal when he arrived. Keegan visited daily, usually in the late afternoon. He brought supplies, books from his personal library, and news from town. Through him, she learned that the men asking questions had taken rooms at the hotel and shown no signs of leaving. "They've been speaking with Sheriff Reed," Keegan reported 5 days into her stay. "Porter overheard them claiming you stole documents from a business associate in Sacramento." Madeline's lips pressed into a thin line. "They're trying to establish a legal pretext to search for me. Reed seems skeptical, at least." Keegan set a basket of fresh bread and preserves on the table. He told them he'd make inquiries, but Wildwood Creek isn't in the habit of hunting down its own citizens for outsiders without proper warrants. Small comfort if they decide to search on their own. She gestured to the papers spread before her. I've been documenting everything: the land fraud scheme, the officials they bribed, the homesteaders they forced out, or worse." Keegan's expression darkened. "How many dead?" "That we know of, 17, her voice caught. "Including Michael." He sat across from her, his presence steady as always. "Tell me about your brother." The request was gentle, an invitation rather than a demand. Madeline found herself speaking of Michael, his quick wit, his idealism, his determination to expose wrongdoing no matter the personal cost. Memories she'd kept tightly contained flowed freely now, painful but somehow healing in the sharing. "He sounds like a man of principle," Keegan said when she finally fell silent. "He was." She wiped away a stray tear. "Too principled for his own safety in the end." Keegan's hand moved across the table, covering hers briefly in a gesture of comfort. "The marshal arrives when?" 10 days from now, according to our arrangement. He'll meet me at Whitefish Creek, north of town. I'll take you there when the time comes." His steady support was becoming something. Madeline relied upon a dangerous development for a woman who had learned the hard way that self-reliance was the only true safety. Yet she couldn't deny the comfort his presence brought, or the way her pulse quickened when she heard his horse approaching each day. As the days passed, their conversations deepened beyond the immediate concerns of safety and justice. They discovered shared interests in literature and history, debated politics, and exchanged stories of their respective pasts, though Madeline noted that Keegan remained reticent about certain aspects of his life before Montana. On the 7th evening of her stay, a violent thunderstorm swept across the territory. Rain lashed against the cabin windows, and lightning split the sky with brilliant flashes that illuminated the interior in stark bursts. Madeline had always hated storms. They reminded her too much of gunfire, of the night Michael died. She sat huddled near the fireplace, trying to focus on the book Keegan had brought, Whitman's Leaves of Grass, rather than the tempest outside. A particularly loud crack of thunder made her jump, the book falling from her hands. Almost immediately afterward came a knock at the door, a familiar pattern that identified the visitor as Keegan. She opened the door to find him drenched, water streaming from his hat and coat. "I was concerned," he explained, stepping inside as she moved back. "The creek rises quickly during storms like this. You rode out in this weather." Madeline hurried to get a towel. "That was foolish." His smile was rueful as he removed his dripping hat. "Perhaps, but I couldn't stop thinking about you out here alone." The simple admission warmed her more than the blazing fire. "Well, since you're here, you might as well stay until it passes." She gestured to a chair near the fireplace. "I'll make coffee." As Keegan removed his wet coat and hung it by the door, Madeline busied herself with the coffee pot. Suddenly aware of the intimacy of the situation, the two of them alone in the cabin, the storm isolating them from the outside world. They sat before the fire, mugs of steaming coffee in hand, listening to the rain beat against the roof. The usual easy conversation between them felt charged somehow, laden with unspoken awareness. "May I ask you something personal?" Madeline finally broke the silence. Keegan nodded, his expression open. "You know most of my story now, but you've shared very little of yours." She met his gaze directly. "What brought you to Montana? What are you running from, Keegan Andrews?" He stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. "What makes you think I'm running from something?" "Takes one to know one," she replied softly. A smile touched his lips briefly before fading. "I was a Union officer during the war," he began. "Afterwards, I returned to Boston to find my father's shipping business in financial trouble. He'd made investments in railroad stock that proved worthless, deliberate fraud, as it turned out." Madeline listened intently as he continued. I spent 2 years gathering evidence against the men responsible, respected businessmen with political connections. When I finally presented my findings to the authorities, I was warned to drop the matter. His jaw tightened at the memory. When I refused, my father's remaining assets were seized on trumped-up charges of tax evasion. He died a month later of shame as much as anything else. "I'm so sorry," Madeline whispered. "The night after his funeral, our house was set ablaze. I barely escaped." Keegan's eyes met hers, the firelight reflecting the pain of old wounds. "I learned then what you discovered in Sacramento, that some men's power reaches beyond the law." "So you came west," he nodded. "Changed my name, bought land, built something new, left the past behind, or tried to." Understanding dawned. "That's why you helped me. You recognized the pattern." "I recognized the look in your eyes," he corrected gently. "The same one I saw in the mirror for years." The revelation of their shared experience, the pursuit of justice, the loss, the flight westward, created a new connection between them, deeper than the tentative friendship that had been growing. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but within the cabin, something else was brewing, a current of attraction and understanding that neither could deny. Keegan set his empty mug aside. "I should go. The rain's letting up." Madeline knew she should agree, should maintain the propriety that had marked their interactions thus far. Instead, she heard herself say, "Stay, please." He studied her face, searching for certainty. "Madeline." "Just until morning," she clarified, though her racing heart suggested other possibilities. The creek might be too dangerous to cross in the dark. It was a reasonable explanation, one that allowed them both to pretend her invitation was purely practical. But when their eyes met across the small space between them, pretense fell away. Keegan moved first, crossing to where she sat. He knelt before her chair, taking her hands in his. "I don't want to take advantage of your situation, of your vulnerability." Madeline freed one hand to touch his face, tracing the strong line of his jaw. "Is that what you think this is? Vulnerability seeking protection, isn't it?" "No." She leaned forward, bringing their faces closer. "This is strength recognizing strength. This is two people who understand loss, finding something worth holding onto." The kiss, when it came, was tentative at first, a question asked and answered in the gentle press of lips. Then it deepened. Years of loneliness and guarded emotions giving way to a hunger neither had acknowledged until this moment. Keegan's arms encircled her, lifting her from the chair as if she weighed nothing. Madeline's fingers tangled in his hair, her body arching against his with an urgency that surprised them both. When he carried her to the bed, there was no hesitation, no doubt, only the certainty that whatever dangers waited beyond the cabin walls, this night belonged to them alone. Dawn broke clear and golden after the storm, sunlight filtering through the cabin windows to cast dappled patterns across the bed. Madeline woke to find Keegan watching her, his expression a mixture of tenderness and concern. "Regrets?" he asked quietly. She touched his face, memorizing its contours with her fingertips. "None." Relief softened his features. "Nor I." He captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "But we must be careful. If anyone learned you were here, I know." Reality was intruding on their brief sanctuary. "The men looking for me won't give up easily." Keegan sat up, the sheet pooling around his waist. "I need to return to the main house before my absence is noted, but I'll come back this evening." They dressed in comfortable silence, the intimacy of the night transforming into a different kind of closeness, a partnership forged in shared secrets and mutual trust. At the door, Keegan pulled her into a final embrace. "6 more days until the marshal arrives. Stay vigilant, always." She smiled up at him. "Be careful in town. They might be watching you now, too." His kiss was a promise before he departed, mounting his horse and riding toward the ranch house without looking back, a precaution they both understood was necessary. Alone again, Madeline moved to the window, watching until he disappeared from view. Her heart was fuller than it had been in years, but anxiety tempered her happiness. She had allowed herself to care deeply for Keegan, to envision a future beyond her current dangers, a dangerous luxury for someone in her position. She returned to the table where her documents lay spread out, a physical reminder of the justice still to be served. Michael deserved no less than her complete commitment to seeing his killers brought to account. Yet as she worked through the morning, organizing her evidence for the marshal, Madeline found her thoughts repeatedly drifting to Keegan, to his touch, his voice, the way he looked at her as if seeing something precious. For the first time since her brother's death, Madeline allowed herself to imagine a life after justice, a life that included love. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. Late that afternoon, as Madeline was preparing a simple meal from the provisions Keegan had brought, she heard hoofbeats approaching too early for his promised return, and too many horses for just one rider. Heart pounding, she quickly gathered her documents, securing them in the hidden pocket of her satchel. She grabbed Hattie's revolver from the drawer, checking that it was loaded before moving to the window. 4 riders were approaching, 3 men in city clothes and Sheriff Reed. No sign of Keegan. Panic flared briefly before her training reasserted itself. Sacramento had taught her to think quickly, to assess options with ruthless clarity. The cabin had no back door, but the window in the sleeping area was large enough to climb through. The woods behind offered cover, and she knew from her morning explorations that a dense thicket of brush about 50 yards back could conceal a person effectively. Decision made, Madeline grabbed her satchel and limped quickly to the window, pushing it open as quietly as possible. The approach of horses grew louder as she maneuvered her injured leg through the opening first, wincing at the strain. She had just pulled her body through and closed the window behind her when a sharp knock came at the cabin door. "Miss Grayson," Sheriff Reed's voice carried clearly. "I need to speak with you." Madeline pressed her back against the cabin wall, inching toward the corner where she would be hidden from view of anyone looking out the windows. When she reached the tree line, she moved as quickly as her leg allowed, heading for the thicket she'd identified. Behind her, she heard the cabin door being forced open, followed by the sounds of men searching inside. She kept moving, fighting the urge to look back, focusing instead on placing each step carefully to minimize noise. The thicket appeared ahead, a dense growth of wild rose bushes and young pines. Madeline pushed through the thorny barrier, ignoring the scratches that tore at her skin and clothes, until she reached a small hollow at the center where she could crouch unseen. Through gaps in the foliage, she watched as the men emerged from the cabin and began searching the immediate area. 2 of them, the strangers from Sacramento, she presumed headed directly for the woods where she had fled. "She can't have gone far," one called to the others. "Not with that bad leg." Madeline held her breath as they approached her hiding place, the revolver clutched tightly in her hand. She wouldn't go back to California, wouldn't let them take the evidence. If it came to it, she would fight. The men passed within 10 feet of the thicket, their attention focused on more obvious hiding spots further into the woods. Madeline remained motionless, scarcely breathing until they moved beyond her position. The search continued for nearly an hour, the men gradually widening their perimeter. Sheriff Reed seemed less enthusiastic than the others, repeatedly suggesting they return to town before losing daylight. Finally, the men gathered near their horses, frustration evident in their postures. "She's being helped by someone local," one of the strangers insisted. "No one just disappears like this." Andrews, another suggested. He was asking questions in town after she vanished. Reed's response was too low for Madeline to hear, but his body language suggested skepticism. As the men mounted and rode away, Madeline remained hidden, unsure if the departure was genuine or a ploy to draw her out. Only when the sound of hooves had long faded did she allow herself to relax slightly. Night was falling. She had no idea where Keegan was, whether he was safe, or if the men had already confronted him. The cabin was no longer secure, which meant she needed a new hiding place until the marshal arrived. Gathering her courage and ignoring the throbbing pain in her leg, Madeline began moving deeper into the woods, away from the cabin and toward the mountains beyond. She had 5 days to survive on her own, to evade capture, and to make the rendezvous with the marshal. 5 days to ensure Michael's death wasn't in vain. And somehow, in the midst of it all, she had to find Keegan to warn him, to ensure his safety and perhaps most importantly, to tell him what she had only just realized herself. That somewhere between his defense of her in town and their night together in the cabin, she had fallen in love with him. The forest grew darker as Madeline pushed further from the cleared land surrounding the cabin. Every step sent pain shooting through her injured leg, but determination drove her forward. She needed distance, needed to find shelter before full night fell. An owl hooted nearby, startling her. The forest was coming alive with night sounds rustling underbrush, distant howls, the whisper of wind through pine needles. Madeline had grown up in these mountains, but that had been years ago, before Sacramento, before Michael's death had changed everything. After nearly an hour of difficult progress, she stumbled upon a small overhang formed by a rocky outcrop. It wasn't ideal, but it offered some protection from the elements and would be difficult to spot in the darkness. Exhausted, she crawled into the space, arranging branches to further conceal the opening. The night grew cold quickly. Madeline huddled against the stone, wrapping her thin shawl more tightly around her shoulders. Sleep was impossible both from the cold and from fear. Her mind raced with questions. Had they arrested Keegan? Would they continue searching at first light? Could she make it to Whitefish Creek alone? Dawn brought no answers but did provide enough light to assess her situation more clearly. The overhang was about 2 miles from the cabin, judging by the rising sun's position. She had no food, no water beyond what remained in the small flask in her satchel, and no clear plan beyond avoiding capture. Grimacing against the stiffness in her injured leg, Madeline emerged from her shelter and took stock of her surroundings. The forest stretched in all directions, but she could make out a line of taller pines to the north that might indicate a creek. Water would be her first priority. She had taken only a few painful steps when a twig snapped nearby. Freezing in place, Madeline slowly drew the revolver from her pocket, her eyes scanning the trees. "It's me." Keegan's voice came softly from behind a large pine. He stepped into view, his expression a mixture of relief and concern. "Thank God you're alive." Madeline nearly collapsed with relief. "Keegan, how did you find me? I've been searching since dawn." He moved to her side, supporting her as her leg threatened to buckle. "When I returned to the cabin last night and found it ransacked, I feared the worst. They came the sheriff and men from Sacramento." She clutched his arm. "They mentioned you by name. I was afraid they'd arrested you." His smile was grim. Not for lack of trying. "Reed came to the ranch after they searched the cabin, asking questions about our relationship. I convinced him I hadn't seen you since you disappeared from town. He believed you. Reed and I have an understanding. He doesn't interfere with my business, and I don't remind him of certain indiscretions from his past." Keegan's expression softened as he examined her face, noting the scratches from the rose thicket. "You're hurt," It's nothing. My leg is worse. The running aggravated the old wound. Concern deepened the lines around his eyes. Can you walk? I have a horse hidden nearby. I'll manage. Madeline straightened, determined not to be a burden. Where can we go? The cabin isn't safe anymore. I have a hunting lodge higher in the mountains. Few know of its existence, and it's defensible if necessary. He supported her weight as they began moving through the forest. We can remain there until it's time to meet the marshal. The journey to Keegan's horse took nearly an hour, each step a test of Madeline's endurance. When they finally reached the animal, a sturdy bay gelding tethered in a small clearing, Keegan helped her mount before swinging up behind her. As they rode deeper into the mountains, following game trails and shallow streams to mask their trail, Madeline leaned back against Keegan's chest, drawing strength from his solid presence. I thought I'd lost you, he murmured against her hair. When I saw the cabin empty, your things scattered. She reached for his hand where it held the reins. I've survived worse. You shouldn't have to. His voice held a fierce protectiveness that warmed her despite the mountain chill. The hunting lodge proved to be a sturdy log structure built against a granite cliff face, nearly invisible until they were almost upon it. Inside was simple but comfortable: a stone fireplace, basic furniture, supplies stored in wooden crates along one wall. No one will find us here, Keegan assured her as he built a fire. The only approach is the way we came, and I've taken precautions over the years to keep this place secret. Madeline sank gratefully onto a bench near the fire, extending her injured leg toward the growing warmth. Precautions. I didn't come west without learning from my mistakes in Boston. He moved to a cabinet, retrieving bandages and a bottle of whiskey. This lodge doesn't appear on any maps of my property. The land survey shows it as impassable terrain. As he knelt to examine her leg, Madeline studied his face, the concentration in his eyes, the slight furrow between his brows, the strength evident in every line. This man had created a life from ruins, just as she was attempting to do. Thank you, she said softly. Not just for this, but for everything, for believing in me when others laughed. His hands paused in their gentle work. I recognized something in you that first day, a determination I understood all too well. He met her gaze directly. What I didn't expect was how quickly you would become essential to me. The simple declaration, delivered without pretense or elaboration, touched Madeline deeply. In their world of calculated risks and necessary deceptions, such honesty was precious. I love you, she said, the words falling from her lips before she could consider their wisdom. I know it's foolish, given everything, but it's true all the same. Keegan's smile transformed his serious features. If that's foolishness, then I'm equally guilty. He leaned forward, his lips finding hers in a kiss that spoke more eloquently than words. For 4 days, the hunting lodge became their sanctuary. They developed a routine, Keegan hunting and checking for signs of pursuit, Madeline resting her leg and preparing what evidence she could salvage for the marshal. At night, they shared the narrow bed, finding in each other's arms a peace neither had known for years. On the 5th morning, Madeline woke to find Keegan already dressed, his expression grave as he studied a map spread on the table. "What is it?" she asked, instantly alert. "Smoke signals from the direction of my ranch." He pointed to the map. "My foreman and I established codes years ago for emergencies. He's warning that strangers are searching the property systematically, not just the sheriff and the men from Sacramento, but hired guns as well." Cold fear gripped Madeline's heart. They won't give up. No. Keegan folded the map decisively. "Which means we need to move up our timeline. The marshal was to meet you at Whitefish Creek tomorrow noon, correct?" She nodded. "We'll leave now, take a different route, and camp near the meeting place tonight. Better to be early and cautious than risk being followed tomorrow. The logic was sound, but Madeline felt a pang of regret at leaving their mountain refuge, perhaps the only place where they had been truly free to be themselves. As if reading her thoughts, Keegan crossed to the bed, sitting beside her and taking her hands in his. "This isn't the end," he said firmly. "Once the evidence is safely delivered and the proper authorities take action, you'll be free of this burden. And then?" She asked, voicing the question that had lingered between them. His eyes held hers steadily. "And then we begin whatever life we choose together, if that's what you want." "It is," she whispered. "More than anything." They packed quickly, taking only essentials. Keegan insisted Madeline wear his heavy coat for the journey, and he armed them both with rifles in addition to her revolver. By mid-morning, they were mounted and heading northwest toward Whitefish Creek, following game trails and creek beds to minimize their tracks. The day passed in tense vigilance, each sound in the forest a potential threat. By sunset, they had reached a ridgeline overlooking the valley where Whitefish Creek meandered between stands of aspen. The meeting place, a distinctive rock formation near a bend in the creek, was visible about a mile distant. "We'll camp here tonight," Keegan decided, helping Madeline dismount. "Good visibility in all directions, and we can reach the meeting place within 20 minutes tomorrow." They made a cold camp, unwilling to risk a fire that might be spotted. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped sharply. They huddled together beneath blankets, taking turns watching for any sign of pursuit. During his watch, Keegan's thoughts turned to the future, a future with Madeline beside him. He had lived alone for so long, focused on building his ranch and burying his past. The possibility of sharing his life with someone who truly understood him, who had faced similar demons and emerged stronger, filled him with a hope he had almost forgotten could exist. When Madeline took her turn at watch, she found herself planning as well, not for escape or survival, but for what might come after. Would they live at Keegan's ranch? Would she continue working at the Gazette? Would they marry? The very ordinariness of these considerations seemed miraculous after a year spent looking over her shoulder. Dawn broke clear and cold, sunlight painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. They ate a sparse breakfast of jerky and water, then packed their few belongings in preparation for the final leg of their journey. "We should reach the meeting place by mid-morning," Keegan said as he checked his rifle. "Better to be there early, establish that there's no ambush." Madeline nodded, securing her satchel with its precious contents. "The marshal's name is William Haynes. He served with Michael briefly during the war and has been investigating land fraud cases throughout the territories. He's trustworthy." "Good." Keegan helped her mount, then swung up behind her. "Let's finish this." They rode down from the ridgeline, following a deer trail that wound through stands of aspen toward the creek. The morning was quiet except for birdsong and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Too quiet, Keegan realized suddenly. No larger animals were moving, no squirrels chattering in the trees ahead. He reined in sharply, every sense alert. "What is it?" Madeline whispered, feeling his tension. "Something's wrong." He scanned the trees ahead, his experienced eye catching what most would miss: a slight movement among the shadows, the glint of sunlight on metal. "Ambush," he breathed, immediately turning the horse. "Hold tight." Before he could spur the horse to a gallop, a shot rang out, the bullet splintering bark inches from their heads. The horse reared in panic, nearly unseating them both. Keegan maintained control, urging the animal into a run back the way they had come. More shots followed, bullets whistling past as they galloped for the cover of denser forest. Madeline clung to the saddle horn, her heart pounding with fear, not for herself but for Keegan. exposed behind her as he guided their desperate flight. They had nearly reached the tree line when Keegan grunted in pain, his body jerking against hers. Madeline felt warm wetness spreading against her back where he pressed against her. "Keegan," she cried. "Keep going," he managed through gritted teeth. "Don't stop." They plunged into the forest, the horse weaving between trees as shots continued behind them. Only when they were deep among the pines did Keegan allow the horse to slow, his breathing ragged against Madeline's neck. "You're hit," she said, twisting to look at him. Blood stained his shirt at the shoulder, his face pale with pain but determined. "Not badly." The lie was obvious in his strained voice. "We need to keep moving. They'll be following." Madeline took stock of their situation with the clarity that danger brought. They couldn't outrun pursuers with Keegan wounded. They needed a defensible position and quickly. "The rock outcrop we passed yesterday," she suggested. "It had that narrow approach and caves behind." Keegan nodded, adjusting their course. "Good thinking." They rode for another mile, Keegan's strength visibly fading as blood continued to seep from his wound. When they reached the outcrop, a massive jumble of boulders thrust up from the forest floor, Madeline helped him dismount, supporting his weight as they climbed to a position that offered both cover and visibility of the approach. Once settled behind a large boulder, she examined his wound. The bullet had passed through his left shoulder, missing bone but causing significant blood loss. Using strips torn from her petticoat, she bandaged it as best she could, her hands steady despite her fear. "How many do you think?" she asked as she worked. Keegan grimaced. "4, maybe 5. Professional manhunters, not the men from Sacramento. They must have hired local talent. The marshal will still come to Whitefish Creek at noon. And we won't be there." Keegan's expression was grim. "They've positioned themselves between us and the meeting place." Madeline's mind raced, considering options. "I could try to reach him alone. My leg is better and I'm smaller, more able to move undetected." "Absolutely not." Keegan's voice was fierce despite his weakness. "They'd kill you on sight. Then we're trapped here." He reached for her hand. "Not trapped. Waiting for the right moment." They fell silent as sounds of pursuit grew closer, men on horseback following their trail, calling to each other as they discovered signs of passage. Madeline readied her revolver, and Keegan positioned his rifle despite the pain that made his hands shake. The hunters spread out as they approached the outcrop, clearly experienced in tracking wounded prey. Madeline counted 4 men, rough-looking characters with the hard eyes of those who killed for payment rather than cause. "Circle around," ordered a bearded man who appeared to be the leader. "Flush them out if they're hiding in those rocks." Madeline and Keegan exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. They would wait until the men were closer, more exposed, before revealing their position. It was their only chance against superior numbers. 2 of the men dismounted, rifles ready as they began climbing the rocky slope. The other 2 maintained positions at the base, effectively cutting off any escape route. Keegan aimed carefully, his breathing controlled despite the pain. When the closest hunter was within 30 feet, he fired. The man fell without a sound, tumbling back down the slope. Chaos erupted as the remaining hunters sought cover, returning fire that ricocheted off the boulders surrounding Madeline and Keegan's position. They were pinned down, outnumbered, with Keegan weakening by the minute. "The evidence," he said during a lull in the firing. "If this goes badly, it won't," Madeline interrupted fiercely. "If it does," he persisted, "you need to destroy it. Better lost than in their hands." She knew he was right, but the thought of Michael's sacrifice being for nothing was unbearable. "We'll get through this," she insisted. "We've both survived worse." A volley of shots peppered their position, chipping stone and sending fragments flying. Madeline returned fire with her revolver, more to keep the hunters at bay than with any real hope of hitting them at this distance. Time stretched, measured in gunshots and tense silence. Keegan's condition deteriorated, his face ashen, his responses slower. Madeline tore more strips from her clothing to reinforce the blood-soaked bandage on his shoulder, fear clutching her heart as she felt his skin growing cold beneath her touch. "Madeline," he murmured during a lull in the firing. "I need to tell you, save your strength," she urged, blinking back tears. "There will be time for talking later." His smile was tender despite his pain. "I've never been one for leaving words unspoken. If these are my last moments, I want you to know that loving you has been the greatest gift of my life." "Stop that," her voice broke. "This isn't how our story ends, Keegan Andrews." Before he could respond, a new sound cut through the forest, multiple horses approaching at speed, followed by authoritative shouts. "United States Marshal, lower your weapons." The hunters froze, caught between their prey and this new threat. "Andrews," called a deep voice from below. "Are you up there?" Hope surged through Madeline. "Yes," she shouted back. "We're here, Keegan's wounded." What followed was a blur of activity, the hunters surrendering or fleeing. Marshal Haynes and his deputies securing the area. A doctor who had accompanied them rushing to attend to Keegan's wound. As they carried Keegan down from the outcrop on an improvised stretcher, Madeline walked beside him, her hand clasping his. "How did you find us?" she asked the marshal, a tall man with a weathered face and kind eyes. "Got word from Porter at the Gazette that you might be in trouble. When we arrived at the meeting place early and saw signs of an ambush being prepared, we circled around." He glanced at the satchel she clutched. "Is that what Michael died for?" Madeline nodded, handing over the documents that had cost so much. "Everything's their names, dates, land transactions, witnesses." The marshal accepted the packet with grave respect. "Your brother was a good man. This will ensure justice is served." As they loaded Keegan into a wagon for the journey to town, Madeline climbed in beside him, her injured leg forgotten in her concern for his more serious wound. "See," she whispered as the wagon began moving, "not the end of our story after all." His smile was weak but genuine. "Just the beginning, I hope." 3 weeks later, Madeline stood on the porch of Keegan's ranch house, watching as riders approached from the direction of town. The autumn sun glinted off the badge of the lead rider, Marshal Haynes, returning as promised with news from Sacramento. Beside her, Keegan leaned against the porch railing, his left arm still in a sling but his color much improved. They had spent these weeks in a strange sort of limbo, recovering from their ordeal, deepening their relationship, yet waiting for final resolution before truly beginning their life together. The marshal dismounted, removing his hat as he climbed the porch steps. "Miss Grayson, Mr. Andrews." "Marshal," Keegan acknowledged. "Good news, I hope, the best kind." Haynes smiled, the expression transforming his stern features. "Arrests have been made in Sacramento, San Francisco, and as far east as St. Louis. The evidence you provided uncovered a conspiracy larger than anyone suspected. The Attorney General himself is overseeing the prosecutions." Relief flooded through Madeline, so powerful she nearly swayed on her feet. Keegan's good arm came around her shoulders, steadying her. "Michael's killers?" she asked, the question that had driven her for so long. "In custody, awaiting trial for murder along with the fraud charges." The marshal's expression softened with sympathy. "It won't bring him back, but he'll have justice." "Thank you," she whispered, unexpected tears filling her eyes, not grief now, but release from the burden she had carried for so long. The marshal stayed only long enough to share details of the investigation. and to assure Madeline that her testimony would not be needed at the trials, her written statement, and the documents themselves were evidence enough. When he departed, promising to send written updates on the case's progress, Madeline and Keegan remained on the porch, watching as the riders disappeared toward town. "It's over," she said wonderingly. "Truly over." Keegan turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Which means it's time to look forward, not back." His eyes searched hers. "The question is, what do you want for your future, Madeline Grayson?" She considered the question seriously. During the weeks of Keegan's recovery, she had resumed work at the Gazette, finding unexpected satisfaction in the routine of small-town journalism after the dangers of her investigation. The townspeople, learning fragments of her story from Porter and Hattie, had revised their opinion of the woman they had once mocked for her limp. "I want to continue working at the Gazette," she said finally. "Porter has offered to make me associate editor." Keegan nodded, unsurprised. "And—" a smile touched her lips. "I want a home, security, purpose." She stepped closer, her hands rising to frame his face. "I want you, Keegan Andrews, if you'll have a woman with a limp and a complicated past." His laugh was warm as he pulled her against him. "I seem to recall saying once that you walked through hell and came home. What I didn't say then was that you'd become my home too." He reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box. "I've been carrying this since the day after we returned from the mountains, waiting for the right moment." He opened it to reveal a simple gold ring set with a single pearl. "Marry me, Madeline. Build a life with me." Her answer was in the kiss she pressed to his lips, in the tears that spilled onto their joined hands, in the way she whispered yes against his mouth like a prayer of thanksgiving. 3 months later, on a crisp winter morning, the people of Wildwood Creek gathered in the white clapboard church to witness the marriage of Keegan Andrews and Madeline Grayson. The bride walked down the aisle with only a slight limp, her copper hair grown out enough to be styled with white flowers, her green eyes bright with a happiness few had ever seen there before. Hattie Miller wept openly in the front pew. Albert Porter stood as Madeline's witness, beaming with fatherly pride. Even Sheriff Reed attended, his presence a tacit acknowledgment of past misjudgments. When Reverend Thompson asked who gave this woman in marriage, it was Marshall Haynes in town specifically for the occasion who stepped forward to say, "In her brother's stead, I do." The vows were simple but profound, exchanged in voices steady with certainty. When Keegan slipped the pearl ring onto Madeline's finger permanently, this time his words carried to the back of the church. "You walked through hell and found your way home. I promise to be that home for all our days." Madeline's response, though whispered, held equal power. "And I promise to stand beside you through whatever comes, with the same strength that brought us here." As they walked back down the aisle together, husband and wife, the same townspeople who had once laughed at Madeline's return stood in respect, many offering smiles and murmured congratulations. Outside, snow began to fall, gentle flakes that melted on Madeline's cheeks like tears of joy as Keegan helped her into the waiting buggy. They rode through Wildwood Creek toward the ranch that would be their home, toward the future they had fought so hard to secure. "Happy?" Keegan asked, his arm warm around her shoulders. Madeline leaned into his embrace, thinking of all they had endured to reach this moment, the losses, the dangers, the difficult journey home. "Beyond words," she answered truthfully. As the snow continued to fall around them, transforming the familiar landscape into something new and beautiful, Madeline thought of Michael. He would have approved of Keegan, would have been pleased to see her finding happiness after such sorrow. "He would be proud of you," Keegan said, once again reading her thoughts. "For seeing it through, for not giving up." She smiled up at him, This man who had defended her when others laughed, who had recognized her strength when others saw only weakness, who had loved her enough to risk everything. "The best memorials aren't built of stone," she said softly. "They're built in how we live after loss, in the justice we seek, the love we find, the home we create." As they passed the town limits, Madeline glanced back once at Wildwood Creek, the place she had fled in search of her brother, the place she had returned to broken but not defeated. The journey had come full circle, but this was not an ending. It was, as Keegan had said, just the beginning. 5 years later, Madeline Andrews stood on the porch of their ranch house, watching as 3 riders approached through the golden light of late afternoon. Her hand rested instinctively on her swollen belly, where their second child grew steadily beneath her heart. Inside, she could hear Keegan's deep voice reading a story to their 4-year-old daughter, Sarah, named for the mother Madeline had lost in childhood. Their voices, one strong and sure, the other small but determined, blended in the peaceful quiet of home. The limp that had once drawn mockery remained, a permanent reminder of all she had survived. But like the memories of Michael, of Sacramento, of that desperate flight through the mountains, it had become integrated into the tapestry of her life, neither forgotten nor defining, simply part of her story. The Gazette thrived under her part-time editorship, her investigative instincts now directed toward local concerns: water rights, school funding, railroad access. The people who had once whispered behind her back now sought her opinion, respected her perspective. And Keegan, her strength, her partner, her home, had proven every promise made. Together they had built a life neither could have imagined during those dark days when justice seemed beyond reach. As the riders drew closer, Madeline recognized Marshal Haynes, now a frequent visitor and honorary uncle to little Sarah. The yearly updates on the California prosecutions had given way to friendship that transcended their original connection. The front door opened behind her and Keegan stepped out, Sarah perched on his shoulders. His free arm circled Madeline's waist, hands splaying protectively over her rounded belly. "Visitors," he observed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Family," she corrected gently. They stood together, watching the approaching riders not with trepidation as they once might have, but with the welcome of people secure in their happiness, in their home, in the life they had fought to build. Madeline thought of that day long ago when she had limped back into Wildwood Creek, wounded in body and spirit, carrying burdens too heavy for one person to bear alone. She remembered the laughter, the mockery, and then Keegan stepping forward to defend her with those simple, powerful words. She walked through hell, and she's home now. How right he had been, though neither of them could have known then what home would come to mean: not just a place, but a person, a love, a family created from the ashes of loss and the triumph of justice. As Sarah wiggled down from her father's shoulders and ran to meet the approaching riders, Madeline leaned into Keegan's embrace, profoundly grateful for the journey that had brought her here, every painful step, every sacrifice, every moment of courage that had led to this peaceful afternoon in the place where she truly belonged. She had walked through hell, yes, but she had come home, and home, she had discovered, was worth every step of the journey.